realized I was speaking outside of my own culture. And I was speaking a language that I wasn't sure students were going to understand. So then I started remembering some things way back a long time ago when I first started Bible college. And we had a professor that forced us to read the most horrible books. A guy named Francis Schaeffer. The guy wore knickers, for Pete's sake. Now, all these years later, I consider myself a disciple of Francis Schaeffer. I will not dress like him. I frankly don't have the build for that. But I consider myself basically a student of his. Of course, I've never met him. And in the opening paragraph of the first book published under his name, Escape from Reason, he said this: if, as churches, you were to call back missionaries from the field, missionaries who are really getting it done, you look at what they're doing, they tell you what you're doing, and you just stand amazed at the work God is doing in these places. You ask them, what is it you're doing? How is it you are getting it done, and it seems like other missionaries are not? They would tell you things you would expect to hear. Of course, they know the spoken language of the people to whom they are ministering. They understand their food, their money. You know, when we had missions conferences when I was a kid, everybody would always ask the question, what do they eat? You would always want to know that. We'd run to their displays to see if they had shrunken heads on their displays, because we knew that would be a good missions conference if they did. And so they understand the currency, the writing, their literature, their speech, their food, everything. But the one thing Schaeffer said you may not expect to hear from them, but the one thing that is crucial is that they understand their thought language. They understand how they think. So somehow in my adult ADD mind, I remembered that from all those years ago, and I thought, oh, if I'm going to minister to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, I should probably try to figure out how they think. And that's what I want to share with you today. I've made my business, particularly with this ministry, but I can also see how I've been doing this elsewhere with other youth ministry I've been involved with my entire adult life, try to understand. So I want to share with you some things that I have learned in this session and the next. And I'm not going to provide you with a silver bullet, because there isn't one. But I know in the larger evangelical world, things like this tend to only have value if they're instrumental. At the end of the day, we have to ask the question, yes, but what do we do? Well, we are eventually going to have to figure out what we need to do. But I also believe that knowledge and wisdom have intrinsic value. And we must need to know our world first in order to speak truth into it. I think I'm in a room of people that are going to agree with me on that. If not, you can't stop me. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to do this talk called Here's the Rebellion, God, Angst, and Urgency, How Existentialism Shaped Our World. A funny thing happened on the way to the lecture hall. No, that is not me in the picture. That is a stock photo. My mom thought that was me when I posted that on Facebook. I was an adjunct professor at Marywood University, about 2 miles across town. Went on Washington Avenue and just head that way, and you'll run right into it. And as an adjunct in what is a relatively large regional university, you can expect to be teaching introductory classes and introductory classes only. Well, there was about a period of 3 semesters where I was the golden child at Marywood. That gold has since tarnished. But I was the golden child at Marywood, and they were working hard to get me to stay because I was being offered to teach classes in 2 departments at the University of Scranton, philosophy and theology, and so I only have so much time. And so my chair called me into her office, and she said, Andy, we're going to have you teach an upper level. What? Oh, like the unicorns, the rainbows, the sparkles, the aerial, music, everything. What? I couldn't believe my ears. No. You want me to teach an upper level? Why? Why should I be given such an honor? Well, I didn't really ask. I just made it look like, well, of course you do. And so my chair said, well, we're going to have you teach this upper level next semester, and we aren't sure if it's going to be either ancient and medieval philosophy or existentialism. and inwardly my spirit groaned. And I thought, oh please, Lord, let it be ancient and medieval, because I can redeem a bunch of doubting Greeks better than I can a bunch of angry Germans. I'm German, I'm allowed to say that. So I thought, oh man, and I'm in no position to barter or to make deals. And of course, it's existentialism. So I realized, all right, I have about 2 weeks that I can talk before I start repeating myself. So unlike the other classes, I'm going to have to dive in and do some study. So I broke in and to my library and started pulling books off my shelf that I thought would help me, and I put together what I consider the 5 pillars of existentialism, which I'm going to share with you this morning. And if you're thinking, this has nothing to do with 21st century mystery, yes it does. So I started looking at these 5 pillars, and I got into the class, and this was a unique class in that everyone in that room wanted to be there, unlike the mandatory classes I have to teach, where students in an intro to philosophy class right up the street here are wondering, why are the Jesuits so mean to me that I have to take an intro class, right? So they're thinking stuff like that. But in this room, everybody wanted to be in there either because of the content or because they knew me from a previous intro class. So there was a bit of a collegiality in that room that sometimes is not achieved until the end of the semester. And we had our first class, we went over the syllabus and all that stuff. The first day, the second day, and I got into these 5 points, and I told them, look, this is going to frame everything we're going to talk about this semester. Every thinker talks about at least one of these, if not, more than one of these in all of their writings. Thank you. First, I appreciate that. So we need to understand the overview and kind of take a look at the forest before we engage with the trees. That's how I think, and so that's how I teach. So I started walking down through the 5. As I got to about the 4th or 5th one, a really odd phenomenon happened in that room. All of these upperclassmen taking this class they don't have to take are all sitting forward on their seats, and they're all paying attention, and their eyes are really wide. And I thought to myself, what is going on? I think I'm a pretty good teacher, but I'm not that good. I'm not second day, first full day of contact good. I have enough knuckle-dragging youth pastor in me to hold an audience, but I know I didn't have that good. And so as I'm talking, you can kind of think about stuff and talk at the same time. When you have adult ADD, that really works in your favor. So I'm trying to think through this, and the Holy Spirit, I feel, just kind of spoke into my life and said, say the quiet part out loud. So I looked at my students and I said, I just described your generation, didn't I? And most all of them in that room said, yes. The things that you just said, if these are indeed the 5 pillars of existentialism, and they have no idea what existentialism really means, but if these are the 5 pillars of existentialism, those are the things we are very concerned about. And I thought, thank you, God, for making me do this. So, over the next several months, actually ever since I taught that class, I've been studying this topic on my own. My poor wife is worried about me because I've read nearly everything, say, Albert Camus has written. So I'm carrying around books that says Happy Death on it, and she's like, are you okay? Oh yeah, it's about suicide. It's great. You want to read it? No. So as we get there, let's just talk about a brief history of ideas. I picked up a book. It was a total impulse buy at Barnes & Noble a few years ago called, and by the way, if you want these slides, you don't feel like you have to take pictures of them, just send me an email and I'll send you a PDF of this PowerPoint. Barnes & Noble saw me coming. Here he comes, guys. Put the books out at eye level. They know I'm gonna buy it. I picked up a book called The Cave and the Light by Arthur Herman. For those of you interested in a history of ideas or a layman's overview of the history of philosophy, I highly recommend it. It's short, single volume. It's not scary. But in The Cave and the Light, Arthur Herman makes makes an argument that at the core of every school of thought, it is either Platonic or Aristotelian. I will explain this if this is unfamiliar territory to you, if you're not. But at the core, everything is either Plato or Aristotle. Plato was very much interested in what a thing is, and I have an illustration to show you. So he's interested in the very top of the outline, or another way of looking at it is a top-down view of knowledge. He wrote, and in the dialogues concerning his great teacher, Socrates, they are discussing what things are at the core, fundamental, or essential level. So take, for instance, one of the four classic texts that deal with the accusation and execution of the Greek philosopher Socrates in 399 BC. That is Euthyphro. That's a dude's name. So Socrates runs into Euthyphro, and basically what is the equivalent of the county clerk's office. Socrates has been summoned to court, and he knows he's in trouble for something. This is going to lead to his execution. And he runs into his buddy Euthyphro, who is serving as a prosecutor, because in a democracy, anybody can be whatever you want to be. And so he's like, look at me, I'm wearing my big boy toga. I'm going to act as a prosecutor today, and I'm bringing charges of murder against my father on a murderer's behalf. My, that is a big boy toga you're wearing. This is the Keystone translation. You won't find this. Which I think is far better than any scholarly work out there. And so Socrates says, hey, you clearly know what you're talking about, so I might be on trial for my life, so maybe you can help me. Please tell me what justice is. And if you ever read that short little dialogue, you will probably be as frustrated as I, because it's never answered. So he's interested in the is. Aristotle, on the other hand, is a bottom-up view of knowledge, throwing his great teacher Plato under the bus in the Nicomachean Ethics and saying, nah, we don't need to begin with first principles because we have all this stuff in front of us. So he's interested in how things work, or what it does. Now, these are broad brushes, but this is what I use in, say, my intro class to help my students understand. And they don't fit neatly into silos, but by and large, Plato is top-down. Aristotle does bottom-up. And according to Herman, every school of thought is at its core either Platonic or Aristotelian. So as I'm reading this book, and I'm moving along in history, I'm getting closer and closer to the first century. So as a guy that has some ministry experience, and I know my way around the Bible and theology, I'm wondering, what are you going to do, if anything, with early Christianity? I was shocked and pleasantly surprised when I got to his chapter on the church and early Christianity, and Herman said, well, for those of you wondering, like, yes, me, what about Christianity? He said it's actually both. Because Jesus of Nazareth perfectly bridged that divide. There is no dualism. I knew that! Or I was hoping I knew that. Because I always thought, this is dumb. Why do we have to keep fighting over this intrinsic instrumental issue? Are not both important? I thought, finally! Yet the church has had pendulum swings back and forth, has it not? In the larger evangelical world, now in the 21st century, particularly North America, the evangelical church, broadly speaking, North American 21st century, is radically Aristotelian, to the point of sometimes radical pragmatism. We're not just asking how it works, but does it work? Or as a consultant for the Bible college I worked for used to say, what's going to get tushes in seats? TIS. How does it work? Okay? So let's just walk through Plato a little bit. So in the famous painting, The School of Athens, Raphael, the Renaissance master, who is now consequently my favorite Ninja Turtle. This painting you've probably seen before. It has what is purported to be Plato and Aristotle work, right in the middle. And you see Plato's right arm extended, his index finger extended up, and he's interested in the is, or a top-down view of knowledge, as I said. And also, excuse me, he's a substance dualist, as are most people who identify as Christian, or believing that the body at death, the soul can survive the body at death. And in fact, in the fourth and final dialogue regarding the death of Socrates in the Phaedo, also a dude's name, Socrates basically says, well, let's get it on with so I can get out of here and go engage with the forms. Which leads us to the forms. So, of course, Plato, this essence of things, he called the forms. Like, in front of you, you have many different shadows or versions of rectangles, whether it be a hymnal, a Bible, a tabletop, your laptop, your notepad. There are many different rectangles in front of you that you can see. Well, all rectangles share the essence of the rectangle that is somewhere in the spiritual realm, right? And as Christians, we think about that too, because we understand that as persons, we share the essence of the person whose perfect form exists in the spiritual realm. Right?
Amen.
Hence why autonomy and human authenticity is a really important thing in terms of Christian doctrine, is it not? So in places like Hebrews 8, and this is like hashtag philosopher props, I read stuff like Hebrews 8, the writer there says that the earthly tabernacle is a mere shadow of the tabernacle in the heavenlies. Did the author of Hebrews have a copy of Republic? These are questions that I want to ask when I get to heaven. No one else will be in that line, so don't worry. Also, he's the guy that's had a significant influence on Christianity, with the material being bad, the immaterial being good. Now, I grew up in a Baptist tradition, so I attended Christian school. We had chapel. I went to camp. We had retreats. And every time we go to like a fall retreat, it's guaranteed the speaker was either going to try to scare us to death by telling us some horrible story. Anybody had an experience like that as a kid? Thank you. I see the hands right from or I knew what the text was going to be. Love not the world, neither the things in the world. For if you love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Oh, no. And then his 3 points were sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I heard that message so many times, I thought, well, if you keep warning me about those 3 things, I bet I'm missing something. Right? But the influence there is because they're all physical, therefore they're all bad. Well, simple reading of Scripture, particularly the first couple pages, after the 6 successive days of creation, no matter what position you take on the timeline, after each successive day, God looked at what he made and said, it is good. How about that? And on the 6th day, he made man and said, it is very good. Oh, imagine that. So that's kind of where some of that influence has come from. However, he's not totally wrong, and we can benefit from a lot of his thinking. His ideas were baptized by Augustine, of course, is a city in Florida. Augustine, or if you want to be really snooty about it, Augustine. Then we have Aristotle. And his position in this painting also is telling. His arm shot out in front of him, fingers splayed, pointed towards the ground. He's interested in the dust. More of a property dualist or a monist. He really wasn't interested in the separation of body and soul, but of course in places like the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about the faculties of the soul, which is instructive for us. There's actually some really good stuff in there. Also some really fantastic things on just French, believe it or not, in the Nicomachean Ethics. He's interested not in the essence of things, but things in themselves. Again, let's look at all the rectangles and compare them. But also, he spoke a lot about this idea of human flourishing. So, if Plato has ideas about the essence of things, then we can look at them and say, these are biblical, Judeo-Christian themes that can help us think. Of course, they're not inspired. I have a Jesuit friend who thinks Socrates will be at the marriage supper of the Lamb. Well, maybe. I mean, I have dibs, to sit next to him if he's there, but I don't know. But we can at least learn there is a hill called truth, and at its summit is Jesus Christ and him crucified. But some of these thinkers have gotten partway up the hill. We ought not pay attention to them, to look. So again, as Plato talked about essences, so we can see some biblical themes even in Aristotle, like this idea of flourishing. which I find interesting in Galatians 5. Aristotle said that a person whose reason faculties aren't controlling their desires will not experience human flourishing, or his word, eudaimonia. In fact, he says you'll experience epithumia, or kind of a divided mind that's going all in a bunch of different directions. Well, Paul in Galatians 5 says that the person who's not spirit-led, their desires are going to overtake them. And guess what they're going to experience? Epithumia. Oh, interesting. Now, would Aristotle come up with a spirit-led thing? No. But it is interesting. Kind of discovered logic, and we can read about even the Christian view of where we get our idea of logic from, of course, from John 1, Jesus being the Word, and he was baptized by Thomas Aquinas. Now, these two schools of thought that have influenced the history of ideas for thousands of years, literally, were the mainstay for nearly 2,000 years. 2,000 plus. I went to Bible college because I didn't like math. So I think my math is kind of right. For nearly 2,000 years. And so we can see how they branch off, and you can follow a thin red line with these ideas. Like I said, you can take Aristotle and take it straight to radical pragmatism. You can actually take Plato and find yourself in the world of Karl Marx pretty easily. Also, in Plato, you have things like what would be your rationalism. And in Aristotle, you have empiricism. So you have the mind, or the is of Plato, and you have the does, how it works, of Aristotle. You see it working out. Both ways. And these things held sway for a long time. But then in the 19th century, new questions started being asked. And it was almost like the Western mind said, yes, but is there a third way? Is there a way to start understanding things? And in the 19th century, really beginning with Soren Kierkegaard, in the first half of the 19th century, considered the father of existentialism, we have a movement that has only gained speed, and yet no one really talks about that by name. Maybe you all do in your circles, having those academic level conversations, but at the street level, nobody's really discussing the difference of absurdity between Sartre, Camus, and, say, Kierkegaard. Nobody's doing that. Yet, these ideas have permeated nearly every facet of Western thought, and they are the basis for nearly everything that we see that is happening today. So it would do us well to understand these ideas. I discovered a book called Existentialism and Christian Belief by a guy named Milton D. Hunnix. It is a short little book, maybe 150 pages. It's so short and skinny, and the margins are so wide that it didn't scare a knuckle-dragging youth ministry guy like me off. I decided to pick it up and read it. And I don't think it's in print any longer, but if you can find it, it is excellent. And he says this: no philosophy has, perhaps, so dramatically identified the human situation as the relevance of Christian gospel as has existentialism. Yet, despite, perhaps because of this, existentialism rewrites the good news of the gospel. It turns it into a subjective drama that overshadows and replaces the objective biblical drama of God, history, and human salvation. It severs man from any objective supernatural support. He is right. This is an apt description, and this book, I believe, was published in 1962. So that's ancient, right? So, did they even have books? But like a codex. So he's absolutely right. Now he's addressing existentialism and Christian belief. He's addressing kind of new wave Christianity that was popping up and really gaining steam in the mid 20th century. But still, it really speaks to some very important issues. So let me give you a couple definitions of existentialism, a couple different ways we can think about it. And again, if I'm going fast, you can't write this all down. I'm trying to get it all in the time that I have, which will be a Christmas miracle.
So if you, again, just send me an email, I'll gladly send you a copy of this. And then you can make it better and send it back. Okay? So here's the first definition. A philosophical movement with roots in the 19th century that calls into question many long-held assumptions. Its primary concerns are those of essence, what a thing is, and how do we know, and action. Well, that sounds a little bit like a couple people we've talked about so far, hasn't it? But it wants to take the ideas of, say, the essence of Plato, or the action, or the does of Aristotle, and upend them, and turn them inside out. So this isn't creating something new, as much as it is radically moving the pieces around to try to come up with something entirely different. Here's another definition. The 5 century-old categories, the movement spans philosophy, art, history, literature, psychology, and theology, populated by both Christians and atheists. So this is one of the interesting, for me, as both a philosopher and a Christian, I guess theologian too. I sometimes have a hard time telling the difference. But the guy who's interested in both theology and philosophy, I find this fascinating because Stoics are Stoics. Epicureans are Epicureans, Platonists are Platonists, Aristotelians are Aristotelians, on and on and on and on. But when you get to existentialism, you have both Christians and non-Christians. So here's a brief list of the dramatis personae of existentialism. So on the left, we have writers, thinkers that identify as Christians. And yes, we can have debate as to what kind of Christian they are. I understand that. But at face value, let's just leave the list the way it is. Soren Kierkegaard, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, Blaise Pascal, to name a few. On the right side, names, some of those names you may recognize, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nobody's going to confuse which list he should be on. Nor would he. I mean, when you write a book called Antichrist, and you say in the book, I am the Antichrist, ooh. Wow. That's, all right, so you have Nietzsche, Camus, and Albert Camus, if you're from South Scranton. Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and his lover Simone de Beauvoir, right? So all of these have influenced Christianity, and I'm not going to say all for the bad, and not just Christianity in specific, but Western thinking in general. And I'm not going to say all for the bad, but not much for the good. Okay? Because it is, again, upending all kinds of ways that have been thought, categories, I believe, and I will not die on this hill, but I believe God used those pagan Greeks to form the categories of thinking, preparing the mind for the gospel. And again, I could be wrong about that, and I'm not going to build an entire theology on that. How could I possibly? But in my study and understanding of philosophy, I do think I'm right. If you can straighten me out, that's fine. I will welcome that. So there's some agreement. I just gave you two little pieces with Plato and Aristotle. I could speak all day on all of that if I wanted to. But some of these folks have come along and completely upended the essence of things, the meaning of things, and the reason we are to do things, which in sometimes is divorced from any objective truth whatsoever. This, ladies and gentlemen, is dangerous ground. In fact, I would call it dangerous. We must be aware. If the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 10 is right, and he is, writing the second most popular verses concerning spiritual warfare, the very first, of course, is Ephesians 6, because that has Vacation Bible School strength to it, because you can dress kids up in tinfoil armor. There is no great helmet, sword, direct with that. Okay. So, 2 Corinthians 10, you don't have that luxury, but the same guy wrote that. In 2 Corinthians 10, he writes to the Corinthians
says, if you live in the world, you're in a fight, but we don't fight as the world fights, nor do we fight with the world's weapons. Our weapons are not of this world, they are divinely forged. For what purpose? To tear down the strongholds that set themselves up against the knowledge of God, taking every thought captive. The battlefield is the mind. The weapons are ideas. We must know them. So, I'm going to blaze through these pretty quickly, because I'm rapidly running out of time with these 5 pillars. And again, this is instructive so that we know. And according to a very popular cartoon when I was a kid, G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle. So you Gen Xers are welcome. You've been recognized. All right, first, time is of the essence. Time is of the essence. Existential means right now. It means right now. The past and future are only considerations for how they affect the present. And, we have this codified in modern scripture, like John Lennon. Imagine all the people living for today. Gross. When I pastored in the inner city, because I'm a Baptist, I can get away with this stuff, and we were doing a Christmas series, our Advent series, I ran out of ideas, new ways to preach the Christmas story, really quick. I had sympathy for men who've been in the pastor for decades, because there's so many ways to skin that cat. But one year I decided to compare the world's view of peace to the biblical view of peace. And so for 4 weeks, I will never do this again. For 4 weeks, I had a member of our worship team, by volunteering only, sing John Lennon's Imagine. And then we would talk about what a real version of peace is. And I had to remind our people every week, please don't sing along and raise your hands. Because they're going to stop it! That's a whole other. When you do liturgy, you remove those dangers. So I see it. Or in things like, you hear it in phrases like, you only live once. The Epicureans also would put that on a t-shirt, YOLO. Or I much prefer the music stylings of Van Halen over John Lennon and or the Beatles. Anyway, but they had a hit song back in the late 1980s called Right Now. Time is of the essence. It means right now. So we don't really need to think about the past. I will talk to my students about things like, so we're walking through this whole Socrates thing, right? And I'm trying to help them understand the shock and awe of how a 70-year-old philosopher was executed by the state in a liberal, free, Western democracy for asking questions. Right? It's kind of like when we preach the gospel to ourselves or we teach it to others. I hope, and I need to do this, and I'll encourage you to do. See, oh God, remind me anew the shock and awe of how amazing this is. Let me never get sick of it. Right? Okay, well, in Socrates is not nearly that big of a deal. But in the history of philosophy, that's a big deal. And I'm trying to get them to understand, so I'm talking through what is a democracy, and I'm trying to help them understand the difference between an Athenian form of government, which a democracy is nothing more than a tyranny with a nice yummy candy coating, versus the American government. And I will ask my students every semester, and what form of government do we have in America? Maybe 1 out of 100, and I'm not exaggerating, students actually knows. Or I'll ask them, who's in charge? The president. No. I don't care who you voted for, it's not the president. They don't understand this idea of a constitutional republic. They don't get it. So because it's the past that's ancient. Or talk about the future. What are you going to have for dinner? I don't know. It's 10. I'm thinking about dinner. Right? McRibs are back. And apparently it's the last time, so these are sad days. But in working with students, if you're trying to figure out how can you not make a commitment to anything, well, how can I? And think about the past almost 3 years now. Everything has been upended. How can we possibly make commitments because we don't know what will happen tomorrow? Freedom. Are we stuck in our circumstances, or can we transcend them? Are we stuck in our circumstances, or can we transcend them? What does it mean to be free? From what? To what? You see, the contemporary 21st century modern conception of freedom means I am completely, totally, and absolutely free to do whatever I want. Complete libertarian freedom, no holds barred, no boundaries, nothing in my way. I am my own master because there's nothing holding me back. This is not the biblical understanding of freedom. You are free from the bondage of sin. You are free to serve God. You are free to love your brothers and sisters. You are free to look forward to being with God forever. You're free to looking for this new life that God is promising you and giving you right now. It is not freedom to do whatever you want. Does fate govern me, or is there any escape? And what does it mean if we are nothing more than dust in the wind or a brick in the wall? Hey, do you know what you get when you take God out of Ecclesiastes? Pink Floyd's Brick in the Wall. Just saying, come on, that's a good classic. I read that on a group of Baptists last week. I got about the same response. Maybe it's just a pet joke. I will keep telling it because I don't know better. So this idea of saying, well, is there something that I can do to get out of this? And what is that? And that word transcend is not used lightly. This isn't a lateral move. If I were feeling spry, I could probably move from one tabletop to another. That's not transcending. I can make that leap. But a transcendent move is above, outside, and beyond. It is getting out of this. Is there any way out of here? For those of you a generation older than me, your songs from your generation, all those protest songs from the 1960s and the Vietnam War, we've got to get out of this place if it's the last thing we ever do. These questions are codified everywhere. And you can even take this idea and go all the way back prior to Plato to Homer's Achilles, and Homer's Iliad, and with its main character Achilles, and you look at fate. It is fate that just seals everything in. Even Homer, with his gods eating grapes and sandwiches on Mount Olympus, or whatever they're doing up there, probably most of it we don't want to know. But even they're bound to fate. There is no escape. There's no off-ramp. There's no on-ramp. And so students are wondering, what is the answer? This is where, of course, I don't need to tell you what it is, do I? But we need to tell it better than anyone else. Make the story as compelling as you can. Authenticity. What is an authentic human person? And the idea that the journey is always greater than the destination. Now, a few of these themes show up in pop art and media all the time. This one is huge. My students in their papers will oftentimes, as they're writing some ambivalent, relative, nonsense about how you can never find an answer, yes or no, and actually claim yes or no is actually wrong, and that sentence falls apart by itself anyway. And then they'll throw a really meaningful quote in there like, well, not all who wander are lost. Do you know who that quote is talking about? Who knew where he was going? To Gondor, to take the throne. Ugh. Sorry, I nearly had a stroke. Can an individual arise from the herd? Is the true self created or discovered? And how does the authentic person engage with truth? Carl Trueman's Rise and Fall of the Modern Self is probably among the most important books I've read in the past 5 years. He really deals well with this issue within terms of human sexuality and dives deep. If you have not yet read that book, I highly recommend it. It's pretty beefy, but it is worth your time. But if you have a social media account, you've seen all of this. You've seen all of this. How many times have you heard it said, whether it's social media or somewhere else, where a person will say, well, I have to say what I really just believe because this is how I really am, and if you don't accept what I say and affirm what I say, you are denying my authenticity. Have you heard that before? Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche both dealt with this herd or plebe mentality. Now, I think Kierkegaard will be in heaven. I really do. And Kierkegaard said that true authenticity is an accomplishment, not a given. I tend to agree. He would say that the natural tendency is just to go with the herd, to go with the flow. And so now we see a culture where everybody's going in the same direction, but everybody claims to be above the herd. That doesn't work. And is a true self created or discovered? Which we'll get to in the last one. But again, for Christian theism, we understand that the true self is not a construct. Not at all. Number 4, ethics is paramount. And this is based on authentic choices. Not necessarily objectively true choices or objectively right choices, but authentic choices. Well, if I really, and this is where the theology of Walt Disney comes to the top. If you've ever seen a Disney film, then you've heard this. If you believe deep down in your heart that X is true, then it must be true. You've seen this movie. Right? So now ethics comes down to, well, I personally think, I personally believe, or I'm going to speak my truth. Again, it's dissolving the objective nature of, in that case, morality. And the question, what is good? From what standard? You see, part of the reason I mentioned that guy in the grown-up toga, Euthyphro, or Euthyphro, you can pronounce it however you like, he's dead, he doesn't care. He can't answer what is justice because he doesn't know what is good. And he comes to the horns of what's called the dilemma because he says, well, the good is what the gods say it is. And Socrates is like, oh, really? Okay. Well, the gods change their minds, they can't get along, and they haven't told us what they want. So what else do you got? Read any chapter in Homer's Iliad, and you will find it's true that they are a bunch of jerks. Achilles' mom, who Zeus owes a favor to. That's messed up. She goes to him after he whines and quits and says, hey, you know, my son is going to die. He's not going to ascend Mount Olympus. So he's asking for a favor. Would you allow the Trojans to pin the Greeks against their ships? And Zeus is like, okay, I owe you one. And then Hera, his wife/sister, comes in and seduces him and gets him to change his mind. That's not good. And so then Euthyphro says, well, they recognize what is good, and they point us toward it. So Socrates says, so good is outside and above them? If that's true, then they are not God. You see, he had no concept that goodness is part of the essence of God. It's omnibenevolence, all good. Emphasis on subjective versus objective moral duties and values. You can talk about that. It's a Star Wars and Avenger morality. Right? So, than Star Wars based on your ages. It came out in 1977, of course. I wasn't allowed to go to the movies back then, but boy, I knew everything I could about the Jedi. I was 5 years old. I knew everything I could, because I thought that was awesome. I still do, although I hate most of the movies or don't. Anyway. So who are the good guys in Star Wars? The Rebellion. Why? What makes them good? Because in later editions added on to the story, we're realizing the Rebellion, they really aren't so good. They're a bunch of murderous thieves. I'm an Imperial sympathizer. Okay, they should have blown up later on. I was at a pastor's conference just last week, talking about this very same thing, and an older pastor said, yeah, but he was really into sci-fi. He said, yeah, but the rebellion is trying to break the fist of power. Okay, but if they're in charge, what does that mean they have? Power. Or the Avengers. What makes them so morally good and Thanos so terrible? In fact, Thanos is just a big ugly stoic. Left-handed, I got it right. He wants to reset the whole thing for the good of everything. Well, I don't agree with that, but that's stoic philosophy. Well, why is that any worse than the Avengers, who are all seeking vengeance? Watch that with a 13-year-old is fascinating, at least in my house. And then lastly, existence precedes essence. There is no metaphysical anchorage for the self. You are, and then you become what you want to be. This is particularly in Sartre, Camus, and Nietzsche, and de Beauvoir. Essence is self-made, becoming over being, and the rise of the Ubermensch. So basically, what they're saying is that you are, and then you become what you want to be. It doesn't take a rocket surgeon to figure out the ramifications of this right now in our 21st century. When you can declare your identity as whom or whatever you want to be, if there's no essence in the spiritual realm, in this case the person of God, to whom all persons' essences are connected, then of course there is no anchor, so there is no boundary. And so this choice making, again, it makes the individual the autonomous captain of their own destiny, that every other person around them has to affirm, has to agree with. If not, you're a bigoted, hating, fill in the blank, whatever. That's you. That's our world. So the bottom line is that the average 18-year-old has been catechized from birth through media schooling and weak teaching. Now don't take that last point, weak teaching, personally. I've given this talk a couple times, and I've given it in some places where I know it's true. Right? So we're talking about the average 18-year-old, that all the forces outside of the home and church are arrayed against them, 2 Corinthians 10. And they have not been armed sufficiently. And then when they get to the later years of high school, get into the workforce, go to college, they are primed to be taken on. They may have authentic beliefs, but they may not hold them as objectively true. This is the biggest problem I see with students in gospel ministry, which happens outside of the classroom. It is very difficult for my students to understand what we're talking about because they do not have a grasp of objective moral duties and values. Even something simple like, is it ever right to torture babies? No. What if you don't know what babies are? Or you've never heard of torture before? Does that still make it objectively wrong? Yes. Okay? Why is it objectively wrong? Because you believe it, Andy? No! We just said, if I don't know or believe anything about it, it's still objectively wrong. They really struggle with that. They will usually default to lived experience over propositional truth claims. You've seen this, haven't you? Well, I know what you said, but, and that brings me back to in the NIV, so this is a bit of a play on translations, but this works for me, so bear with me. In the NIV, Hebrews chapter 1, the first 5 words, in the past, God spoke. Is that true? Well, if it's not, then what's to stop you? But if he has spoken through creation, Israel, angels, prophets, and in these latter days through his Son. Hold fast. Difficulties arise when propositional revealed theology clashes with lived experience. Again, hold your ground. Hold fast. And I don't need to preach to this choir to tell you to be logically sound, have it make sense. You know, your greatest argument for someone that is wayward in their thinking is not, that doesn't work anymore, right? And if you can't convince them, that's not your job to, even if you give them a great argument and they can't see it, you can at least stand before God and say, I've honored you with truth and logic that comes from you. Solutions. Again, I do not have a silver bullet. I don't. So for those of you waiting for like the shoe to drop, I don't have them. But I would encourage you to at least do some secondary source reading on some of these things. Some of those knuckleheads are really hard to read. Some of it's like looking at a train wreck. You know you shouldn't, but you can't help it. But there are resources out there to help you, just so you can understand a mindset, and then ask God for wisdom, and learn to ask good questions. These are all good ways to start. I know I've gone over, but I did my best. I hope you still do this. Can I pray as we close? And then we're going to take a break or something. I'm not sure. Oh God, our help in ages past. There are men and women in this room, myself included, who are desperately concerned about the times in which we live. God, I ask that you help us to understand them so that we can know what to do. God, I thank you for faithful men and women who have not relinquished their grip on truth, their grip on reality, their shock and awe of who you are and what you continue to do in this world against all odds as we see them. Oh God, help us to cling to those things, to remember you are the one who has moved hearts of kings. And it is nothing for you to move the heart of a teenager or young adult in our churches. God, help us to be sensitive. Help us to be wise. Help us to be courageous and strong. We love you. In Jesus' name.